She saved the Apache chief's son. 3 days later, the entire tribe returned. The boy was sinking, arms flailing, mouth open in a silent scream. His fingers grasped at empty air as the sand swallowed him whole. No one moved. Not the ranchers, not the women clutching their rosaries on the ridge. Even the marshal, ever so proud in his polished badge, just stood there, one hand resting casually near the grip of his pistol, the other shading his eyes. Only one figure broke from the crowd, a woman, no longer young, her dark skirt catching the dry wind like a sail. Yossi didn't ask for permission. She never did. She dropped her satchel, tore off her shawl, and ran. Her boots dug hard into the cracked earth as she sprinted toward the quagmire. "Aguanta, niño. I see you," she called, though the boy could no longer hear. With each step, the ground seemed to groan under her, but she didn't slow. The moment her hand caught his wrist, the sand resisted like a beast. For a second, it felt like it wanted both of them. But she pulled, cursed, pulled again. And when the boy's head broke free with a cough and a wail, the entire canyon seemed to exhale. They say the desert swallows what it wants. That day it chose not to. The boy's name was Taka. Apache. Enemy. Or so the town had decided long before he ever stepped foot near Ridge Spring. His presence should have meant trouble. But trouble had been brewing long before him. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where we unravel the stories that never made it into textbooks. Forgotten heroes, impossible choices, and the fragile lines between survival and surrender. If you're drawn to tales of grit, hope, and the choices that shape history, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. Yossi never planned to be anyone's savior. Once a long time ago, she had been a mother. That was before the fever took her son in one endless night of sweat and silence. Before she stitched her life back together with herbs, poultices, and pain. In Ridge Spring, folks didn't call her doctor. They called her Sanadora, healer. She'd set broken bones, delivered babies, whispered to God in 3 tongues when prayer seemed like the only thing left. She didn't ask for thanks, and she sure as hell didn't ask for judgment. But judgment always came. After she pulled the boy free, Marshal Brand made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of message her action sent. "That child," he spat, "may be small, but he belongs to a tribe that burned wagons and strung up ranchers last spring." Yossi didn't flinch. Then maybe it's time someone pulled them out of the fire instead of throwing more in. Brand wasn't the only one watching her. The town did what it always did, stared, eyes like bayonets from under wide-brimmed hats. Some narrowed in confusion, others in disapproval. A few, maybe in wonder. But no one said a word. Back at her cabin, Taka sat curled on a wool blanket, sipping broth he didn't ask for. He hadn't said a word since the sand. Yossi didn't push him. She knew trauma. It speaks slowly or not at all. What mattered was that he lived. What came next would test more than his recovery. It would test the soul of Ridge Spring. The boy wasn't just some lost child. He was a spark, and the land was dry. There had always been tension in Ridge Spring, the kind that sits under your skin like a splinter. You feel it, even if you can't always say where it is. 2 years ago, cattle started vanishing, sometimes horses too. No witnesses, no tracks, just smoke trails and unease. Folks blamed the Apache. The Apache blamed settlers trespassing sacred burial grounds. Then came the summer raids. Fast, brutal, and surgical. Not every settler survived. Not every Apache made a home. No one really won. By the time Taka stumbled into that sand pit, the town had been coiled so tight you could hear it creak. Marshal Brand had begun drilling local men every Sunday like they were forming a militia. There were whispers of shipments of new rifles coming through. Reverend Hartley stopped preaching forgiveness and started preaching defense. Women began hiding knives under floorboards. Children stopped playing outside past dusk. And in all of that, Yossi remained the stubborn, inconvenient middle. She had delivered Apache babies, prayed with Mexican widows, and bandaged white ranchers shot in border skirmishes. She'd also warned again and again that this wasn't going to end with one clean line in the dirt. But no one listens to a healer when the world wants a soldier. Taka's presence brought that tension into Yossi's home. But she didn't send him away. Not because she believed in peace. Peace was a myth she'd stopped chasing years ago, but because she believed in consequence. If you let a boy die because of the color of his skin, what does that make you? Word spread fast. It always did. By sundown, the entire town had heard about the Indian kid hiding in Yossi's place. Some called it a betrayal. Some said it was bravery. Most just muttered and watched. Marshal Brand demanded a meeting. He needs to be handed over before his people come looking. Yossi stood her ground. And if they do, Brand's jaw flexed. Then we'll be ready to... He always talked like a man itching for a reason. Yossi knew his type. Men who wore guns like promises, and promises like warnings. But the town wasn't a single voice. Reverend Hartley, perhaps surprisingly, urged caution. We're still recovering from the last standoff, he said. More violence will only bring more graves. Others, Sarah Bell, who'd lost her father in the last raid, or Calvin Jones, who traded beef with a neighboring tribe, split between anger and hesitation. Ridge Spring was small, but its people were not simple. They were scared, and scared people are unpredictable. And so the boy stayed, at least for one night. Yossi gave him space, gave the town time to think. And somewhere in the dust and tension, a choice was forming. Not just about a boy, not even about peace, but about what kind of place Ridge Spring would become. Taka hadn't spoken for 2 days. Not even a whisper. He ate what was given, slept on the wool blanket like a curled animal, and flinched every time a bootstep passed near the cabin. Yossi knew the look. That deep, hollow quiet of someone who had seen too much, too fast. But on the third night, as the wind carried in the scent of a distant fire, the boy turned to her and said, in a rasp barely above breath, "You are not afraid." Yossi didn't answer right away. She stirred the coals of the stove, set down the ladle, and sat across from him. "No," she said finally, "but I'm tired." That night, the moon rose sharp and hard above Ridge Spring. So did the rumors. Bram was calling for a town gathering. Reverend Hartley had agreed to host it in the old stone church, not out of sympathy, but out of obligation. Better to speak in sanctuary than let bullets talk first. When Yossi walked in the next morning with Taka trailing behind her, all eyes shifted. The pews creaked with bodies leaning forward, some out of curiosity, most out of caution. Marshal Brand stood near the altar like it was a courtroom. His hand rested casually near his belt, close to the holster. "We can't keep ignoring the obvious," he began, voice clear, clipped. "This boy shouldn't be here. His people have taken enough from us. Letting him stay is like inviting wolves to sleep at your feet." Murmurs followed. A few nods. Sarah Bell, arms crossed, stared straight at Taka with a fire in her eyes. Others avoided looking at him at all. Yossi raised her hand, not high but steady. She didn't speak loud, but somehow the room went still. "What if we stopped acting like we're already at war?" she said. Brand scoffed. "You'd have us do what, exactly? Shake hands? Break bread?" "Yes," Yossi said plainly. For 2 weeks, the room blinked. Confused silence, as if no one had quite processed what she said. "I'm proposing we try something different," she continued. "A trial. A swap. For 14 days, I'll live with the Apache. And they send someone to stay here in Ridge Spring. Neutral people. Observers. We eat their food. They eat ours. No weapons. Just eyes and ears and open hands." Brand barked a bitter laugh. "You want to play pen pals with the same tribe that ambushed our wagons?" Yossi looked at him, then the room. "You think they're all the same? That a child is a killer because of the dust on his skin? But what if he isn't? What if they aren't? If we don't know them, how can we hate them honestly?" Reverend Hartley, for once, didn't interrupt. He leaned on his cane, deep in thought. Someone from the back stood. "Calvin Jones. I've traded with him before. Mostly food, hides. Never had a problem. But I wouldn't sleep beside him that I don't ask you to," Yossi replied. "Just let me try. One healer for one observer. They'll know we're serious. Maybe that's enough to stop more blood." "What if they don't play fair?" someone asked. "Then at least we tried something besides bullets," she said. Brand stepped forward, voice lowering. "You're betting all our lives on the hope that savages understand goodwill." "And oh," Yossi said, "I'm betting mine. That's the difference. That IT wasn't a vote. Not yet. But it was a crack in the stone. That night, The town argued in whispers behind closed doors. The church's old bell never rang, but the tension was louder than any sermon. The next morning, Taka spoke again. "They will think it's a trick." Yossi nodded. "Maybe, but your people trust you," the boy shrugged. "Some. My uncle is Tyaga. He leads now. He listens before war." Yossi smiled. "Then we speak to Taiga." It took a half-day's ride, one drawn-out negotiation with Reverend Hartley, who insisted on accompanying her as a moral buffer in a fire circle in the southern canyon. The meeting place was neutral ground. No weapons. Just wind, dust, and wary glances. Tyaga was younger than expected. Sharp eyes, skin painted for sun and silence. He didn't offer welcome or threat, just patience. Yossi explained her idea. One healer for one guest. A trial. No politics. No demands. Only observation. Tyaga listened in silence. When she finished, he looked at Taka. The boy didn't speak, but the slight nod was enough. "I send my niece," Tyaga said. "Lihua. She is not warrior. She is mine. We will see if your people have mine too." It was more than Yossi hoped. Back in Ridge Spring, Lihua's arrival drew stares. She was young, barely 17, but walked with the stillness of someone raised in watchful places. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She ate sparingly. She slept in the church's loft under Reverend Hartley's roof, watched by half the town and guarded by the ghost of mistrust. But she watched, too. Everything. How the butcher salted meat. How the blacksmith cursed his tools. How the children stared at her like she might disappear. She asked questions, quiet, polite. And she answered them, too. About rituals. About stories. About fear. Meanwhile, Yossi lived among the Apache. She learned quickly. No loud words. No fast hands. Respect was shown through silence, not performance. She cleaned roots with the elder women. Helped set broken arms with ash and paste. Listened to stories carved into bark and memory. And slowly, the line between us and them began to blur. After 10 days, there had been no blood. No theft. No threat. Just two worlds orbiting each other with cautious curiosity. Ridge Spring didn't relax, but it began to breathe again. Brand, of course, hated it. "They're playing us," he warned. "Just buying time." But no one answered, because even he could see it when Taka walked freely across the square without whispers. When Lihua laughed with the baker's daughter. When Yossi sent letters back, describing not warriors but farmers, mothers, and grief that IT was working. The sand had a sound to it. Not loud, not even clear, just a muffled hiss like breath through teeth. Yossi didn't hear it so much as feel it. A subtle dread climbing her legs as she charged forward. The boy was nearly under by the time she reached him. Only his eyes visible now, wide and wet with panic, darting in all directions like a cornered animal. His hand, the only part of him still above the surface, stretched toward her in a final, instinctive plea. She grabbed it without thinking. Her own boots started to slip, and for one sharp second, it felt like the earth was about to take them both. But she'd been in worse places. Birth beds soaked in blood. Back alleys where the cholera stank like burnt sugar. War fields where no one screamed anymore. This was just sand. She leaned back, anchored her heels, and pulled. The boy's arm gave a jolt, then his shoulder, his chest, until finally he broke free with a wet gasp, coughing sand, body trembling from shock and terror. The crowd behind her still hadn't moved. She didn't wait for applause. There was none. Yossi wrapped him in her shawl, hoisted his small frame up in both arms, and turned away from the silence. Someone muttered something. Leave him, or maybe she's mad. Didn't matter. The boy's heart was racing against her ribs. He was light but alive. That was all that counted. Back at her home, she placed him gently on the cot in the corner. Her hands moved automatically, checking pulse, lifting lids, brushing off grit from his nostrils and mouth. His body was exhausted, but he was stable. What came next wouldn't be medical. It would be psychological and far harder to treat. Yossi moved to the basin, splashed water on her face. The lines around her eyes had deepened in the mirror. She didn't care. Not about that. But as she looked down at the bowl and saw the reflection of the boy's face behind her, she felt something stir. Not pride, not relief, something heavier and older. The fever had taken her son in the middle of winter. Back then, she'd lived 2 towns over, near the southern hills. He was 7, always chasing lizards, always running barefoot no matter how many times she scolded him. One night, he came home with a cough and didn't wake up again. She'd boiled roots, burned prayers, whispered everything she ever learned in 3 languages. But death didn't listen. When she buried him, the ground was so hard she had to trade a full bottle of her best tincture for a shovel. The next day, she packed up and moved north. Not because she thought she'd outrun grief, but because she couldn't breathe in that house anymore. Now here was another boy, Finn, shivering, eyes flicking between her and the doorway, like he was waiting to be dragged away. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. He wasn't ready, and neither was she. When she finally sat beside him, he flinched. She didn't reach out, just spoke. Calm, even. My name's Yossi. This is my home. You're safe now. He didn't blink, just stared. So she tried again, this time switching to Apache, not fluent but passable. He didn't respond to that either, though his eyes showed the slightest flicker. She tried Spanish. Nothing. Maybe he didn't trust her words. Maybe he just didn't trust words at all. That night, she heard him cry in his sleep. Not loud, but broken, like someone who'd run out of ways to scream. She sat by the fire and didn't sleep, just listened. Morning brought dust and decisions. She knew the town would want answers, knew that Marshall Brand would be pounding her door by noon, but all she could focus on was the boy's breathing. It had steadied during the night. That was something. His eyes were still shut, but his jaw had unclenched, a sign of release, or maybe resignation. Later, she found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, quietly sipping broth. He hadn't asked for it, just accepted it when she placed the bowl nearby. Progress, maybe. She moved slowly, not to startle him, sat on the floor opposite, mirroring his posture. No questions, just presence, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. Minutes passed. Then, unprompted, the boy whispered, "They left me." His voice cracked like brittle clay. She said nothing, just let the words fill the space between them. "My father," he ran. "The sand pulled me down," and he ran. Again, no tears, just that dry, factual kind of horror only children know how to express. Yossi swallowed. Carefully. "He was afraid," she said quietly. "That doesn't mean he didn't love you." The boy looked down. He didn't look back. Yossi leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect us fail. That doesn't make it your fault." The boy didn't respond, but she saw it. His shoulders relaxed, if only slightly. She didn't ask his name yet. Names were sacred. You don't demand them. You earn them. The boy didn't speak again that day, but his silence had shifted, less guarded, more tired. That mattered. It always did. Yossi knew the language of trauma, not the kind that screams or lashes out, the kind that folds in on itself, hides behind eyes too old for their age. It was in the way he ate now, small, slow bites but steady. In the way he scanned the windows, not out of panic but calculation. He was no longer waiting to die. He was trying to understand why he was still alive. By sundown, Ridge Spring knew. They always knew. Word traveled faster than horses when fear was involved. That the witch doctor woman had dragged an Apache child into town, rescued him, sheltered him, fed him. There were whispers at the general store, hard stares at the well, hands brushing pistols for no reason but habit. Brand hadn't knocked yet, but she felt his presence like a storm creeping in behind the horizon. Yossi spent the evening sharpening knives, not to fight but because the rhythm calmed her. The boy watched from the cot. After a while, he asked quietly, "Why did you come for me?" She paused, blade in hand, eyes still on the whetstone. "Because no one else did." He studied her, as if testing for sarcasm, for agenda. But there was none, only truth, a raw, matter-of-fact sort of truth that seemed to puzzle him. "You didn't know me," he said. "I didn't have to." Silence again. Then he looked down at his own hands, small, dirty, scabbed over in places. "I thought I was going to die." The words came out flat, not poetic, just real. "And I wasn't scared of the sand. I was scared no one would come." Yossi nodded slowly. That kind of fear leaves a mark. Do you have it? He asked. Yes, she said. I still do. He didn't ask for the story, but she gave it anyway. Not all of it. Just enough. My son was sick, she said. 7 years old. He coughed for a week. Fever burned through him. I did everything I knew. Nothing worked. When he stopped breathing, I was holding him. She didn't cry when she said it. Not because she was strong, but because it had taken her years to run out of tears. And now there was only scar tissue. The boy didn't say anything, but he shifted slightly closer. Not much. Just enough that the message was clear. He'd heard her. Later that night, she found him curled not in the cot, but beside the hearth where the warmth was stronger. She didn't move him, just laid another blanket over his shoulders. That was the moment she made the decision. Not loud, not declared, but firm. She would not hand him over. Not to the town, not to Brand, not even to his own people, if they came back for him with suspicion in their eyes. The boy hadn't just survived the sand. He had survived abandonment. That was the deeper wound. And Yossi knew too well what kind of man it created if left to fester. The knock came at dawn point, 3 hard raps. No delay. Marshal Brand thought he didn't wait to be let in. The man had no use for ceremony. Hat tucked under one arm, revolver prominent at his hip, he stepped into her cabin like it belonged to him. Behind him, 2 town men. Not deputies, just volunteers with fear behind their eyes and too much time on their hands. Brand looked at the boy, then at Yossi. So it's true. Yossi stayed seated. He's not a threat. He's Apache. He's a child. Brand's jaw tensed. That doesn't matter. They scout with kids. They use him to map routes, to steal food, to check for traps. He could be drawing them here right now. Yossi stood. You think if they wanted to burn Ridge Spring again, they'd send a half-dead boy to scout it? Maybe, Brand snapped. Or maybe they're just watching to see how soft we've gotten. The boy hadn't moved. He sat quietly, watching the exchange like someone used to danger. His eyes flicked toward the door. No fear, just awareness. Yossi moved between them. You'll have to step over me. Brand smirked. Don't tempt me. One of the men behind him shifted nervously. Maybe we wait. Just a day. Let the council talk it through. Brand turned sharply. Council won't stop what's coming. They never do. But if we grab the boy now, the man said, and they do come looking, that'll be war. Brand didn't answer. Yossi did. He stays. If they want a reason not to fight, give them one. The silence stretched. Then Brand cursed under his breath and walked out. Yossi exhaled only after the door shut. Her knees felt weak, but she didn't sit. Not yet. The boy said, they don't like me. No, she said. They don't understand you. Not yet. He looked up at her. Do you? Not fully, she admitted. But I'm trying. That night, he gave her his name. Not the one his father used. The one his mother gave him when he was born, Taka. It meant to rise again, though she didn't ask that. She knew the meaning without needing the translation. You could see it in his eyes. In the way he sat a little straighter. In the way he no longer scanned the door every few seconds. Taka was learning how to trust. Not just her, but himself. Yossi felt something stir again. Something more dangerous than grief. Hope. It scared her. But she didn't push it away. She would fight for that boy. And not just with words. The door shook with 3 heavy knocks. Not rushed, but deliberate. Each one sounding like a warning carved into wood. Yossi already knew it was Brand before her fingers touched the handle. When she opened it, the marshal stepped in without waiting, like he owned the air in the room. Hat tucked under one arm, revolver hanging heavy at his side, eyes scanning the space and landing fast on the boy. Behind him, Harper stood taut and over-ready while Eli Lang hovered near the doorframe, less sure, more human. Taka sat at the far end of the room, spoon paused mid-air. He didn't flinch. That told Yossi more than any words. 3 days ago, that same knock would have sent him under the table. Brand's eyes locked on him. So it's true. You're sheltering him. I'm keeping him alive. He's Apache. He's a child. That shut him up for half a breath. Brand took a step forward. I don't need to explain the risk. You know what happened last spring. You saw what they did to Tompkins Ranch. You saw the smoke. I also saw who lit the fire. And it wasn't this boy. Maybe not. But he's their blood. That's not a crime. It is when blood calls to blood. Eli shifted behind him. His boots made a nervous creak on the wood. Marshall, maybe we talk outside. Brand didn't even turn. I'm taking the boy. Tonight. For questioning. For safety. Yossi didn't back down. You'll have to step over me. Don't tempt me. Her voice didn't waver. You drag him out of here, you better be ready for what that looks like. People are scared. Yes, but scared folks think clearer than you give them credit for. You go too far, they'll turn. Brand's jaw clenched so tight Yossi could almost hear crack. He looked at the boy. He speak yet? No answer. Until the boy said calmly, my name is Taka. My uncle is Tyaga. I don't know where my father is. His voice was dry and clear, unshaken. So you understand English. Taka nodded. You were part of the group that came through here 3 weeks ago. No, I was not there. You expect me to believe that. You believe what you want. I know where I was. Brand seemed thrown for a beat. He looked at Yossi like she was conjuring spirits. I'll be back tomorrow. With Reverend Hartley. We'll do this official. Yossi didn't speak until the door shut and their footsteps faded. Taka broke the quiet. He smells like iron. That's fear, she said, covered in gun oil. By sunset, the church bell rang, calling the town not to pray, but to argue. The benches filled quick. Ranchers, widows, the schoolmistress, even old man Jacob, who never left his porch, came hobbling in. Taka walked in beside Yossi, steady on his feet, head up. The room didn't speak, but it breathed differently. She could feel the stairs scraping over them like dry wind. Hartley opened with that voice of his, low and deliberate. We're not here to judge. We're here to listen. But Brand didn't need an invitation. He stepped forward and laid it out cold. A boy shows up. One of theirs. She keeps him. We do nothing. What's next? The whole tribe camps in the square. You want to wait until we're burning again. You know who they are. We know what they've done. Yossi didn't interrupt. She let the fear circle the room. Let the temperature rise until it was ready to crack. Then she stood. You keep saying they like it's one thing. Like a child and a raider are the same. You've seen what they do. Don't pretend you're naive. I've seen what we do too. I've buried their dead. Patched up our wounded. They're wounded. You suggesting we're the same. I'm saying war doesn't care who started it. It only wants more. The room stilled. The silence came thick. Sarah Bell rose up near the back. My father died in the raid. Shot in the back. I know. I'm sorry. But was it him who shot your father? She didn't answer. I'm not asking you to forgive. I'm asking you to aim right. Brand's voice cut back and sharp. What's your plan then? Let the kid live in your house forever. Be our friend. Eat our food while his people circle in the hills. I'm saying we try something before we go digging new graves. Reverend Hartley stepped up finally. He didn't look at Brand. He looked at Taka. You afraid of us, son? Taka answered steady. Only of hate. The whole church went quiet again. No coves. No boots tapping the floor. Hartley nodded once. Then maybe we give him time. Watched. Protected. But here. Brand looked ready to spit nails, but Hartley didn't budge. You wanted order. This is it. As the crowd filed out, mumbling into night air, Taka stood on the porch beside Yossi. They didn't clap, he said. No, but they didn't throw anything either. That's a start. Taka didn't sleep much that night, and neither did Yossi, though neither of them said out loud. The quiet between them was different now, not heavy with dread, but sharp with awareness. Something had shifted in the town, not trust yet, but pause. The kind of pause that comes before a storm or a decision. In the morning, word spread that someone had carved a crude symbol into the church door, 3 lines crossed by a 4th Apache, counting mark for blood debt. Brand arrived not long after dragging a man by the collar, a young ranch hand named Walker, who stank of whiskey and excuses. Said it was just a joke, but no one laughed, not even Brand. The town was split, some seeing it as a prank, others as a threat. Taka said nothing. He just watched, and that seemed to unsettle people more than if he'd yelled. By midday, Brand was back at Yossi's doorstep this time. Without his hat, no posturing, just the hard edge of someone tired of pretending. We need to talk, he said, not a demand, just a line drawn and waiting. Yossi didn't invite him in, but she didn't shut the door either. He stood in the threshold. I was a boy during the treaty years, he said. Thought peace was possible, once thought we could share the land, then they took my sister. She was 9. Maybe they'd remember. Maybe they'd resist. And when that time came, she'd be close. Watching. Listening. ready to return if needed, or step in before the damage got too deep. Because peace isn't a destination. It's a habit, a stubborn one, a daily choice. And some of us, we're just here to remind you how to choose it. If you've made it this far with us, you've felt the weight of every step, every word, every line that made Ridge spring more than a town. It made it a promise. And we're not done. Bigger storms are coming. Political tensions are rising. Military forces are circling. What happened in Ridge Spring was only the first test. The next challenge? It won't be between two groups. It'll be between those who want power and those who want people to live free. And when that fire sparks, you'll want to be here when it hits. So if this story moved you, if these voices mattered, do one thing. Like the video, comment what hit you hardest, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. We'll be back soon.